connections were good or bad, that's up for debate, but it should be taught. And the dangers are that, not enough teachers are teaching about the empire, and the government in itself is sort of, it's really against teaching about the empire in any way that might suggest that empire could be presented negatively. Okay, if we do teach about the British Empire, it's about teaching it in a good light. And that in itself could be seen as quite inaccurate in some cases. It could also be seen as pushing a certain agenda. And, history classes, as it says here, they're effectively becoming propaganda classes. And that's something that as academics and historians and teachers, we really need to try avoiding in our classrooms. Okay, so these are some of the topics that are taught. I'm not going to go through all of them. As always, if you have any questions, please do just put them into the chat. I'll make sure I keep checking, or that Kuba notifies me if anything is being asked. So this is essentially what's taught to children from their first year in secondary school, so from 11 years old. Okay, so the things they could be taught about is largely looking at medieval Britain. So remember, the focus is on Britain. Of course, the medieval period, it could be looking at lots of parts of Europe. So there's already a lot of restrictions here of just teaching about medieval Britain. And a lot of the things that are taught, things like the Norman conquest, obviously there's a lot of positives of teaching this. It introduces pupils to, different forms of rule, kind of how there was a struggle between the crown and church. Also looking at how parliament forms in Britain, obviously things that does make Britain and its democracy quite unique. But for a lot of people as well, they see this as quite restrictive. When we're teaching about the Crusades, whose perspective are we teaching it from? Are we looking at the Crusades from a Christian perspective? Are we looking at the Crusades from a Muslim perspective? It becomes quite a tricky topic to teach, especially when it's so vague, and you sort of leave teachers often without the resources to kind of be teaching these topics. But of course, we've also got things that are very much traditional history, as I was trying to get at before. So you've got the Wars of the Roses, Henry VII, which obviously we do need to learn about when you're looking at the Tudor monarchy, all the different changes that are brought, even the change in religion, from going from Catholicism to Protestantism and the Church of England. So of course, there's lots of important aspects, but this is also taught to children sometimes in primary school. So the fact is that some topics are being repetitively taught to pupils without adding anything new. So unless it's taught in a really different way, unless it's taught about, did the Tudor monarchs really want England to become Protestant, or were they driven by other factors? If it's not presenting that sort of debate, then as teachers, we need to consider how much value is it really bringing to the classroom if all we're teaching is a narrative and a set of facts, which obviously history is more than that. It's more than a fact, or it's more than just a timeline of events. And then we get to this church, state, and society in Britain. So again, we're looking at the Renaissance period. Again, this in itself has certain connotations. What is meant by the Renaissance? Whose Renaissance are we looking at? Are we looking at Europe's Renaissance? Are we looking at simply just Britain having a role in the Renaissance period? And then we have a really interesting debate here about how the Catholic Church is portrayed in British history. So again, children will usually be taught this from about 11 to 12. So again, it's in their first year of school. Obviously, not all of this is taught. Teachers can select which bits they wish to teach. You are teaching this to kids that you only see about once a week. History is only taught once a week for less than an hour in children's first year in secondary school. So this isn't in any way an exhaustive list. Obviously, we don't have time to teach all of these topics. So it's up to the school to choose. But an interesting debate I've picked here is how is the Catholic Church portrayed in British history? And for many British historians, so I've said there, they portray the medieval Catholic Church as corrupt. And it sort of suggests that the Reformation, obviously this is being challenged, but there are some teachers who still sort of portray it this way. It's suggesting that the Reformation was, the beginning of progress. The sort of Catholic Church can often be portrayed as, almost a force of evil, in a sense that, Protestantism is what, progressed England, especially when you look at Queen Elizabeth I and the Elizabethan religious settlement and her sort of, war against the Catholics. So there are certain debates and certain biases that are in the way that we teach Tudor history, the way that we teach Britain's sort of relationship with the church, with the Pope, and in the way that we teach about Catholicism in Britain as well. And then just to go through what children learn when they're about 13 years old. One of the biggest things they will learn about is Britain's transatlantic slave trade. So most schools will choose this topic. Whether this topic is taught very well is another debate completely. Because the way it's usually taught is sort of America's role in slavery. It's not really taught in the way that Britain was involved in the slave trade. Or it's not really taught in the sense of, the British Caribbean, for example, Britain, even though they may have not had slaves on British soil, there are a lot of British men and women who were living in the Caribbean, living in places like British Jamaica at the time, in Barbados, who did have slaves, who did have big plantations. And that is something that isn't really focused on in schools. It's really sort of focusing on, America's issue with race and sort of, America's Black problem, when really I think Black history, and especially Black British history, it has a really big role in Britain as well. It's not just an American issue. Just think if you've got any questions. So now that we've sort of looked at what sort of is being taught, so what we're really trying to get at here, or what I am trying to get at here, is that the way the slave trade is taught, summarized by Eric Williams. So he's a Trinidadian historian, and he suggests that British historians write almost as if Britain had introduced slavery. So basically they began the slave trade almost for the satisfaction of abolishing it. So we kind of learn a little bit about the slave trade. We learn about slaves going to America, and then we learn about Britain somehow having a huge role in sort of ending the slave trade. Now, of course, it's quite a problematic narrative. It sort of ignores Britain's role in slavery, ignores how much of Britain's wealth was also made through slavery. If you're looking at the sort of plantations in sort of Jamaica, a lot of the sugar that is coming to Britain in the sort of early 1800s, a lot of the sort of sugars being produced in Jamaica, coming to Britain, being sold here, being used here, that's usually neglected. So we usually see slavery as an exclusively American problem. And that's something that, a lot of teachers are challenging. A lot of historians are looking at how Britain's role in slavery is written, and we are trying to sort of teach it in a way that is accurate and in a way that does get students to really think a bit more critically and sort of see it as, it's not solely an American issue. There are a lot of European powers that were involved in slavery, and that needs to be recognized. And it can't just be seen as Britain ending the slave trade. Okay, it's not just Britain who ends it. It has a long history within it. And of course, if you sort of just look through some of these other topics, we look at Britain as the first industrial nation. We sort of look at, British industry. We're looking at the Victorian period here, which obviously is a really exciting period for children to learn about, the sort of Victorian era. And there's a lot of different debates as well, what makes someone Victorian. Obviously the Victorian era is named after Queen Victoria, but it's really hard for, really young students to think about, what does that mean? What does it mean to be Victorian? Or what does it mean to be Roman? What does it mean to be a Georgian? So it depends on how it's really being taught, and how we can really get pupils to think about that, there isn't a fixed identity, there isn't a fixed way of being British either. It's a multiple different ways of being part of that identity. And the really interesting thing that I'd like to draw attention to is the development of the British Empire is on here. So that's really interesting, because a lot of people do say that we're not teaching enough about the empire. Well, the government has included it. So then the question is, why are teachers not teaching it? Why are people so afraid to teach about Britain's colonial history? Why are teachers afraid to talk about some of the tricky issues? Britain's relationship with India, really turbulent relationship, very often a quite violent relationship. Why are people so afraid to, address these issues? And, what are we trying to shield from our children? What are we trying to shield from them learning about it? Because, classrooms should be a really safe environment for pupils to learn about these sort of issues. And, teachers are an authority figure. They should be accurately looking at what they're teaching. They should be presenting the different debates and allowing for children to explore those debates. There's a bit of a danger if you completely shy away from a topic and you don't teach it, And, the children, you'll just use the internet anyway, and you can't always obviously rely on what you read on the internet or the sources on there. So it's quite important for teachers to be very careful about, how do we present this in a way that's both accurate, that allows children to debate it, but also that allows them to challenge anything that they could see, in example, in the media or on the internet, and sort of already have their own views about it. So that's quite a big debate, how much of the British Empire do we teach? And then lastly, so this is a bit where I'm getting about with interaction with Polish history, which one of you guys asked. So children at the age of, so about 13 to I'd say about 14, this is where we sort of learn about the world wars. That is essentially seen as, the year that children just learn about the world wars at school. So already we learn a little bit about women's suffrage, which is just how did women gain the vote in Britain. And then we look at the First World War, and we look at predominantly Britain's role in the First World War as well. So we look a little bit at the context, but the way it's taught is very much from a Western European perspective. We don't really learn that much about Eastern European history. We don't really learn about the sort of other empires before World War I, what the relationships were between those powers. Is very much looking at, Britain, France, Germany at the time. And that's very much the way that the First World War is taught. And then we look at the Great Depression. Again, we look at its impact on Britain mainly, or on Western Europe. And we look at the rise of dictators. So this is effectively Hitler, Mussolini, Franco. So again, very much Germany, France, Spain. This is a very Western European kind of push. And I've sort of written here, so what's our interaction with Polish history? So as I've already mentioned, we really look at Poland within the context of World War II. So we sort of, essentially the way we teach it as well is that Hitler invaded Poland. A few days later, Britain declares war on Hitler. We don't really look at the intricacies of, what was really happening in Poland at that time. And we don't really look at any of the pacts that were drawn between the Polish and German governments. There is a very small reference that we do have to, the free city of Danzig, and we look at the Polish corridor. This is just, a small teaching point. It's not looked at in very much detail. And again, it just is that sort of question, how much of a narrative are we creating about how students here might view Polish history, if the only way we sort of interact with Britain and Poland's history is, Poland being seen as a victim in the Second World War. So it's almost creating this narrative or idea that, Poland as a whole country was a victim, without looking at, the resistance movement within Poland, the sort of experiences of Polish people. So there's a lot that's missing, and there's a lot of pieces that teachers need to be responsible for in drawing together. So they need to be responsible for, how do we teach about this? How do we teach about, a whole country without just reducing it to being a victim? So as I said, we look at, the German invasion of Poland, and also a huge thing that is taught in Britain is a Holocaust. So it was the Holocaust Memorial Day a few weeks ago, and we usually teach about the Holocaust. But again, there's a debate around how are we teaching about the Holocaust? Who were the victims of the Holocaust? I mean, we usually see it as a really broad view that it was the Jewish people, but within that, we're not really including Slavic people or people of Slavic descent who were victims of the Holocaust, and Polish Jews particularly are not really included in that debate. It's just very much restricted to, a number, so 6 million Jews, and that's how it's usually taught to children. And again, there are some teachers that are really working towards sort of, categorizing, what did it mean to be a victim in the Holocaust? What did it mean to be a survivor? What did it mean for a lot of the sort of different countries? Usually there would be a trip at this age, at 13 to 14, to Auschwitz. But again, this depends on how much the school has funding. So it's not a compulsory trip. I wish it was. For many people, it'd be a very humbling experience to go to Auschwitz, especially for school children. But unfortunately, it's down to how much the school can fund. If you've got 100 children, the school might be very limited with how much money it has to send students to Poland, and to sort of explore Auschwitz as well and sort of get a feel for it for themselves. So it is unfortunate that these sort of trips do depend a lot on money, whether schools can afford it or not. And a bit further, so if we sort of are studying Polish history post World War II, it's usually looking at Poland under the Soviet rule. So again, it's very much looking at Poland as, it's not looking at Poland as an active country. It's kind of putting Soviet rule at the top, at the forefront of the focus. We usually have a whole module that looks at the Cold War, or we look at we sort of have modules that look at communist rule in Eastern Europe. So, we just define it as, communist rule in Eastern Europe, so all grouped together. And we often sort of look at how the Polish People's Republic had its own kind of movement with solidarity. That's usually something that does come up. Also the sort of bread riots, or the bread protests. So there are small sort of interactions, I'd say, with Polish history, more so than the other Eastern European countries. That could be due to, with obviously Britain having a huge sort of Polish community. I know the school I work in now has quite a few Polish children as well. So it does depend on the school, if they want to get into a bit more detail about Poland during the war and during the interwar years, especially if they've got a Polish community, then some schools will, but more often than not, it's not gone into a huge amount of detail. But Poland under the Soviet rule, interestingly, unlike how it's portrayed during the Second World War, under the Soviet rule is often sort of portrayed as quite defiant, as quite brave. It's usually one of the countries that students will look at as a case study. And, what was a resistance movement in Poland? How did the workers respond? There's obviously a big emphasis on Polish workers and, people defying the communist rule through, striking and obviously through holding their own free elections. And we obviously look at solidarity as well. So don't get me wrong, Polish history is taught. It's often quite minimal, but the narrative, it changes. It depends on how the teacher teaches it. And I would agree that the way I've taught Polish history and the way a lot of teachers I've come into contact with, Poland is often portrayed in this sort of, very defiant, brave, small country. I don't know why, but usually children think of Poland as being a really small country as well. I think perhaps it relates to how they learn about it in the Second World War, with it being invaded, that they have this idea of it, being small. So I suppose that links to, how much geography are we teaching to our pupils, and why do they have these sort of misconceptions or these ideas? So just to sort of end it off, I know I've been speaking a lot, please do just put your questions in. There will obviously be time for Q&A at the end. So I've said this was Britain's history, how it's hugely portrayed. This is how some of you might have known Britain's history, very much about the monarchy, kings, queens, Shakespeare. And this is what British history is for me. And for me, it's really about, as I've already said, and as you've probably already learned, it's about Britain's interaction with other countries. It's about Britain's interaction with this empire, in Africa, in Asia. There's a long history Britain has, and often there are elements of that history that have been quite brutal, the way Britain has treated people under its rule in these countries, the way it's treated India, the sort of massacres that have happened in African nations and in India under British rule. So of course, it's a really difficult topic. And I think the fear is that if we teach about these sort of horrible things that have happened, somehow children will have less respect for Britain. And I think that's not what the debate should be at all. It's not a debate about, having respect or feeling patriotic. The debate is history, and quite often history is quite ugly. When we already learn about the Second World War, the Holocaust, we sort of learn about, Nazi crimes against Jewish people, but we need to sort of learn that lots of other crimes have happened in history. Genocides aren't something that's new. Usually people who are under colonial rule, who were under the British Empire, they did suffer. Some progress, if you like, was brought. Yes, certain systems, certain British law and rules were introduced, but quite often those people did not benefit from it. And I think teachers, this is just my opinion, you don't have to agree, I think teachers should not be scared to teach, the dark side of Britain's history, especially because of, the country is so rich now in terms of its culture, in terms of the people it has here, in terms of all the sort of languages, the food in Britain. And that would not be possible if it wasn't for Britain's empire, if it wasn't for all these other countries that's already connected with, so Britain's national story, so that the history of Britain, quite simply, cannot be understood without looking at the history of the countries that it ruled, and whether it ruled these countries fairly, whether it ruled these countries quite brutally. That's up for a debate. That should be a debate in a history classroom for people to have. But I think it should be taught. I don't think it should be hidden. I don't think it should be some sort of dark secret that we pretend never happened. So these are some of the pictures that are to illustrate it. And just when you look at Britain's community now, people like myself, Britain has a huge sort of South Asian community, huge Indian, Pakistani community. It has a huge community of people from other parts of Europe, people from the Caribbean, people from Africa. And, a lot of these people haven't just come to Britain now. We've got people who've been in Britain for generations, even before the Second World War, there were huge sort of communities in Britain. And that's this idea of, Britain's empire coming home, all these countries that's ruled so far away. And then obviously these people will settle in Britain. They've been sometimes asked to come to Britain. If you look at that picture at the bottom on the Windrush generation, so, these were people coming, were invited to come over to Britain. And it just shows that, the history is still very much alive today, and we can't understand Britain's history without looking at all these other past countries that it's been so well linked to. So that's a big part of the national debate, and that's a debate that's happening now. How do we teach about the British Empire? So that's a huge debate that's ongoing. It's been going on for, a really long time. It's not a new debate. It's not been sort of spurred on all of a sudden. It's a debate that's been going on for quite a while. And then the last slide that I just want to get to, and the last point, before you can ask any questions or ask about any points that I've raised in this PowerPoint, is what is British history? What makes British history in essence? It's not enough to do this idea of diverse history, so about all the other countries Britain has ruled, without recognizing that Britain's history and its empire was diverse. Okay, so it's not just, we're just doing this to sort of equal something out or make it fairer for people. The fact is that Britain's empire was diverse, and to sort of teach it as if it wasn't would be inaccurate. So Britain is a lot more than just its kings and queens. It's a lot more than this sort of, traditional idea that it's about its monarchy. And many hold this false assumption that collective memory, so how people in Britain remember our history, and so this idea of how the country as a whole remembers, they have this really false idea that, if we learn more about the British Empire, we're going to start forgetting about previous British history. I'll get to your point in a second, Natalia. Could you say something about Elizabeth I Tudor? Do you want to explain more on the question, what you mean by that, whilst I go through this, and then I'll get back to your point, what you'd like me to talk to you about Elizabeth? So the idea is that, if we learn more about British Empire, we must forget about, the Tudors, for example, when that's not it at all. We're trying to say, if you teach about small elements of Britain's, really long history, it gives children a fuller image of what Britain is, rather than this image that, it is just about kings and queens, and, that's not accurate. That's not how history should be done. It should be done to be taught in a way that, covers the whole image of the country, and not just Britain in itself, but as I've said, its interaction with its colonies and other countries that it ruled. And this final sort of point I want you to leave on, this whole conceptness of Britishness, what does it mean to be British? It needs to be considered more historically, because in the mid-19th century, if we're talking about the 1800s here, Sri Lanka was as much part of a British identity as Lancashire. Sri Lanka would be exporting tea to Britain. We see tea as an essential part of Britain, and we see tea as something that English people drink. But where is it coming from? Who's growing this tea? Who's behind this British identity? Tea's not being grown here. Tea can't grow in Britain. And then I've just left it on this quote of what Stuart Hall says about what does it mean to be British? What is British history? And Stuart Hall, he's a Jamaican, he's a British Jamaican-born sociologist, he's a historian, and he says people like me who came to England in the 1950s have been there for centuries symbolically. He said, I was coming home. I am the sugar at the bottom of the English cup of tea. I am the sweet tooth. I am the sugar of the plantations that rotted generations of English children's teeth. There are thousands of others beside me because they don't grow it in Lancashire. Not a single tea plantation exists within the United Kingdom. And tea is a symbolization of English identity. What does anybody in the world know about an English person except that they can't get through the day without a cup of tea? And where does it come from? Sri Lanka, India. There's no English history without that other history. And that's essentially, my big debate for today, that England's history or Britain's history, encapsulates every other history as well. So it's not just about the story of Britain, because there is no story of Britain without looking at, the story of the British Empire and the story of all the countries that, made Britain essentially as well. So we can't look at Britain without looking at India, without looking at Jamaica, without looking at all the countries in Africa that Britain had ruled and had a part in, without looking at South Africa. So that would be my main point for today, that Britain's history is the history of many other countries as well. And I'll just go to the questions now. I think somebody had posted. So Natalia, could you say something about Elizabeth I, the Tudor? So what is exactly you'd like me to talk about with Elizabeth I? So thanks a lot for listening. So please do ask any questions if you have any for me. If you have any directed for Cuba as well, anything about, it doesn't have to be about history, it could be about the education system here, about university, about higher level education. So how you want to make the most of it, what you would like to get out of it. Of course, please feel free to unmute as well and ask a question if you'd like to ask.
So maybe I can ask a question. It's more about the actual teaching, not the history itself. Because from my friends from England, I've heard a lot of things being said about behavior of the kids in class. For example, kids who set on fire the whole school, or like other things that maybe are not really just good, you could say. And my question is, what is your experience teaching, like, because you said you teach kids like 11 to 16, or you were planning to teach, so what is your experience working with those people, those kids?
I think as schools in any country, Britain obviously has its issues with some schools with the behavior, but for me, it depends on the school's behavior policy. So schools are really different. So the government doesn't have a set of guidelines of, these are the policies you should have in school. Children must wear uniform, or children must refer to teachers in this way, or children must be in lessons at this time. The government isn't responsible for that. And as with many countries, British schools have to set their own system. In terms of my own experiences, I'd say I've not really had any, anything as extreme as, children setting fire to classrooms, as you say. I think that's quite an exception, and quite rare to happen in schools here. I'd say largely the issue could be in terms of potentially children talking back. So it's quite small, minor things, and I'm sure your teachers can relate as well. So maybe children sort of being cheeky or speaking a bit out of line, if they feel a bit confident to. But, usually my school has quite a strict system in place, and we give children warnings, and these warnings build up to detentions. So largely at my school, the behavior is quite good. There might be the small sort of issues, children might fight, but I think all schools will experience that. So, it depends on the school's policy. And also it depends on the individual teacher as well. If you're quite new, if you're a new teacher, children might challenge you a little bit more because they want to test you, but that's not the case in all schools. Thank you for your question. Julia, what event in history are you most interested in? That's a brilliant question. Thank you. I'd say, so whilst I was at university, I did my dissertation, or like my big thesis, on the partition of India. So, how did British rule affect India? How did India effectively be split into modern day Pakistan and Bangladesh? So that's my big interest. I really like learning about empire. I really like learning about things that happened. I really like learning about this history because, it's a big part of my history. I'm British Pakistani myself. I probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for, British rule in India, for example, because a lot of people in South Asia were invited to come to Britain in big numbers in the 1970s, 1980s. So I think for me, learning about my own roots and my own history, even though it can be quite, upsetting, quite brutal history, what happened in India when it was split, especially because there's so much violence, between Muslims, between Hindus, there's big legacy, this sort of big hole that the British left in ruling India. I think that's one of the key events I'm really interested in, so the partition of India. Anyone else got any questions? Please do unmute. And like I said, it doesn't have to be about history. I know you've been listening to me going on about it. It could just be about the education system here, British schools. Alexandra, how long have you been teaching history? So I'm basically training now. So I'm not a full teacher. I'm not fully qualified yet. I'm in my training year, but hopefully I'll qualify in June. And by this time it'll be about a year. So I'm very, very early on in my teaching career. So it's, and in terms of how many lessons I teach a week, I have another teacher who's kind of, my mentor. She's in charge, and I usually take on over her classes. So I have some classes that are just completely mine, and other classes that I'm sharing with another teacher. So I'm still really early on in my career. So I'd say if I gave you a solid answer, it'd be almost a year of how long I've been teaching history. Thank you for that question. Do you have any kind of live lessons where you go to museums or go for historic trips? Okay, so I think I touched on it, that usually a big one when children are 13 to 14, when they're first learning about the Second World War. Obviously, it's very interesting for people to be learning about the Second World War, and they're really interested in learning about the Holocaust. It's quite shocking. It would usually be Auschwitz. So Auschwitz would be the trip. We go to museums usually. This depends on the school. So again, I'm afraid there's no government policy. History is not a compulsory subject, so therefore students do not have to go on to trips for history. So it's up to the school to organize it. So usually we'd go to local museums. We might go to the big museums in London, the British Imperial Museum or the British War Museum. Obviously, due to COVID, we haven't been able to. And sometimes children are also can go to Flanders Field, so in Belgium. So when they're studying about the world wars. But again, it's not compulsory, and it's expensive going to these trips abroad. It's quite expensive just even taking children to London. So for a lot of schools, it's about the money. It can't really be that affordable. But when it is, we sometimes have guest people, like people who work in museums. They might come to the school, so that usually works around it. So if schools can't afford it, they might have historians or curators in museums that come in and show children artifacts and speak a little bit about history. So I think the way to get around it is to bring the history to the school rather than taking children physically to the history, if that makes sense. Regarding the curriculum, considering British Empire and colonialism is a huge part of many British citizens who are from ethnically diverse communities who here live in the UK, how do you feel the teaching of British Empire and colonialism should be addressed? Okay, so to translate your question, I think you're correct. It is a huge part of children's identity. I mean, it's quite hard to separate the two. Britain, as I've said, a lot of people, a lot of the sort of Britain being very multicultural, which is what makes it so special and so different, and being multiracial, it does owe to that legacy that it has. Even if you watch, the Commonwealth Games, if you ever watch the Commonwealth Games, all these countries that were formerly part of Britain's empire, at one point they'd be colonies, but now they're part of the Commonwealth. I think it is really important that it is addressed in schools, that we do talk about the British Empire and how we teach it. I think it should definitely be taught with sensitivity. It should definitely be taught in a way that children can see. It's not about balancing it. It's not about saying, oh, was Britain good or was it bad? I think it's a bit of both. The answer is definitely both. But but I think it's definitely about making those small steps of trying to teach it, trying to get students to think about the British Empire. You know, why were certain countries under Britain's rule? How did people in those countries feel as well? So it's not just about, you know, looking at Britain. It's about looking at the people under Britain's rule. I think for me that's really important and something I'd like to focus on. Okay, that's a really good question. So if we learn about local histories of the region, we have a very small module on that. So it's usually, I know my school is really good at doing it. So we might look at a local history of Leeds. So we might look at go into like Kirkstall Abbey, so former monasteries, for example. That would also be forming part of a trip. And that's usually quite popular. It has a small museum. So Kirkstall Abbey would be quite a local history trip. So schools are really good at doing that. That's usually done when children are young. Like I said, it's up to the school to really think about what history they want to put in. That's why it's so difficult to think about, you know, which history is the most important. Do we want children to learn about world history, about Britain's history, about local history? I guess the answer is all three, really. You want to make sure you kind of make it as round of a picture as possible. Have you ever been to Poland? Yes, I have been. I've been to Auschwitz as well, so I've been there about 2 years ago. I really enjoyed going to Krakow. I think it's very sort of historically rich city. I think it's, especially the structure of its sort of buildings, its churches, it's very beautiful. I think it makes it very different to some capitals as well. Do the students usually like learning history? Are there many students interested in the subject? Okay, I think it's Maya who asked that. It depends. Some students love history, some students hate it. It can depend on the teacher, how the teacher teaches it. You know, I usually try and be really enthusiastic and really happy when I'm sort of teaching it, and I try and teach it in a way that's very serious as well. As in, you know, I will tell students, okay, I want you to be respectful when we're learning about, you know, the Holocaust or the slave trade. It depends on how you teach it. If you teach the topics with respect, and you sort of teach them with respect, I think the pupils respond to that and they do take it seriously. And for some students, the history we teach, they can't connect. So if you teach about the Tudors, for example, if you do just teach about you know, the monarchs, Renaissance, sometimes, you know, small students, even we can't really connect to that, you know, what it meant. So it depends. If you're teaching a history they can connect and relate to, it definitely makes it a lot more enjoyable for them. Do we learn about the special dialects for the region? I'd say this is more something that is taught in English. There might be someone who's a bit more specialized to speak on this, but when we're learning about sort of dialects or sort of language that is used, I assume you're referring to how different the accents are in Britain, you know, the different sort of accents, you know, it's not just a London accent, and there's lots of different ones. I'd say those dialects are learned a lot more in English when they look at the development of language, but sometimes we do look at dialects when, say, we use sources. So we might use really old English, or we might use sources from the modern day. So someone who might speak, you know, sort of English that uses sort of Jamaican sort of colloquialisms, Jamaican language. So it depends what sort of regions you take it from. So if we're looking at little scripts and I teach children, right, so this is like a small source, this is what somebody said, I want us to read it. They sometimes are already curious, you know, what kind of accent would that be read in? Why is it English so different? You know, what do those words mean? So we definitely do learn a little bit about dialects in history, I would say. So this is from Martha, do British schools give more freedom in children and teens education, or more strict and demanding? I'd say, so it depends what you mean. So freedom in terms of, there is freedom in, you know, after 14 years old, you know, they do their GCSEs. So these are their 2 years formal examinations. there is a lot of freedom. Children get to choose what they want to do, but some schools can be quite strict, okay? And because some schools want to make sure that children pick the right sort of subjects. So by this, I mean, they want to make sure children do stuff like history. They want to make sure children learn another language like French or Spanish, because it obviously looks good. As if you can get as many qualifications as you can, it will help that child. So, some schools, if they're being really clever about it, if they are thinking about the kids, if they have the money to as well, obviously you've got teachers in the school, it costs to have so many teachers, not everyone can afford to have, a teacher teaching French, Spanish, Italian, Russian, whatever, so it does depend on the school. So just because some schools might not give kids more freedom and therefore the kids don't do, as well in topics, that doesn't mean the school's bad. It could just also depend on funding. As I've talked a lot already in the UK, it might, be quite new to you, but a lot of the issues in UK schools does depend on money, does depend on how much funding we can give. And obviously, as you know, money affects the quality of the education as well students will be given. So I would say the schools are not very, they can be strict, but again, it really does depend on the school. So Ola, what made you interested in history? That's a brilliant question. I'd say I didn't really like history when I was in secondary schools from 11 to 16. I didn't really enjoy it because all I really remember is we just learned about the First World War, the Second World War. I can't really remember much else. It wasn't as diverse as it is now. I don't remember learning anything about slavery. I don't remember learning anything about any history that could be related to me, about India. I don't remember learning about any history on Eastern Europe either. So for me, the history was very much just about the First and Second World War. But I think I got but I did well in the exam. So I chose it when I was 16 to 18. And I really enjoyed it. I remember the modules were on the Cold War, and we looked a lot into sort of the American-Soviet relationship. And then we learned in a really big amount of detail the sort of rule for a lot of these Eastern European countries. We looked at Poland under Soviet rule. We looked at the Czech Republic. We looked at Slovakia. We looked at all the different sort of Soviet republics. So for me, that was really, really interesting to get something that wasn't just about British or English history, but kind of looking at other aspects of Europe that we've never looked at before. What people are like in Britain in general, Alexandra? That's a really vague question. That's really broad. I would say it depends what people you're talking about. It depends what experiences you have. I mean, British people, I think, are divided among lots of lines. So, people aren't just divided in terms of their class, in terms of, what jobs they have. I'd say